The resume is designed not to get you the job, it's to get the call. Employers are really interested in the last sort of 5 years of employment. You're in competition with other people. And if your resume is not up to scratch, it stands out so clearly about creating a point of difference with yourself. This person's just making it too easy for me. I really want to call them because they've actually been proactive in thinking this through. They've used a font and I'm so inclined not to call them because of the choice of the font they've used. Certain colours, psychologically, that have been proven that are more attractive to read, it's going to be picked up by AI and rated high because this person's mentioned it 3 times in their resume. Classic example, don't answer the phone if you're in the bathroom. Putting down personal interests, I'm a big fan of. I don't mind if your personal interests are completely eclectic and way out there.
Welcome to Inside the Real Job with me, your host, Yenfu Chen. Get ready to explore the world of diverse careers while fascinating stories await. We'll delve into the pros and cons while witnessing ever-evolving industries. Join me as we connect with individuals from all walks of life, unveiling their secrets and navigating the dynamic world of work. Let's embark on this journey into the realm of real jobs. Well, Peter, thanks for catching up with me again. This time we're doing something a little bit different than what we did previously. We're going to talk about CV tips.
Yeah.
And obviously you're the right person to talk to because you help people prepare for their CVs and interviews as a recruiter.
I had a bit of experience in this area.
Yeah, just a little bit, hey? All right, why don't we start with the first one? So, Peter, can you explain to us what the purpose of a resume is?
The resume is designed not to get you the job, it's to get the call, so that caught the interest of the employer or the person that's going to be looking for this position, and it's allowing them to want to call you and go through a series of questions.
That makes sense. So the resume is purely to get in front of the hiring manager to go, hey, this person is worth having a conversation with.
Absolutely.
All right, well, let's break down the actual resume. From my experience, my understanding is there's a couple of common things people should think about.
Yep.
Is A, you should have it no more than 2 pages. You should obviously highlight how your current role is going to transition or tailor it to the role that you're applying for. There's a couple of other things, but from your point of view, what are some of the common mistakes you see?
Sure. Length is definitely something to factor in. Employers are really interested in the last sort of 5 years of employment. Prior to that should be really a summary of your experience, but putting that down to 2 pages is really the optimum. I think even 3 now that these days is too long. And it's important, your resume, to make sure that all the dates line up and there's no gaps in your employment. And if there are gaps in your employment, explain them. Be on the front foot where you are right up to the present day. So if it says that you're currently employed and you're not, say that. The more you explain yourself on paper and it's accurate and the dates, months are there, that's what somebody who's screening is looking for, the detail. And it's showing also that you're organised and prepared. It's a representation of you on paper and how organised you are in your thoughts. Another areas that I tend to see, got to be wary, is using different fonts. In the resume world, there's about 3 different fonts you should use, something that's very easy to read. So choosing a font that is consistent the whole way through. Change the size of fonts, but I've seen resumes with different fonts through it and it's just too busy on the eye.
Yeah.
Spelling and grammar is something that's just expected to be perfect. So you should proofread and have someone proofread your document. There's no room for errors in that space. You've also got to remember, one of the things that people forget when they're doing a resume is I may be looking at a role where I'm recruiting and reviewing 30 to 40 resumes, and I'm making a comparison on how resumes are structured and how well thought they are, how accurate they are, and a reflection of that person. So you're in competition with other people. And if your resume is not up to scratch, it stands out so clearly and you're not likely to get a call for this role. Our inclination to want to call you is driven by how well you represent yourself on paper.
Good point.
Also, one of the things I recommend these days is putting residency status on your resume. It's probably something that people haven't focused on in the past, but we have a large migration drive from the Australian government at the moment. So we've got anywhere up to 110, 120,000 people coming into Sydney sometimes a week, and having your entitlement to work, like I'm an Australian citizen or I'm a permanent resident or I'm on this visa that allows me to work full-time unlimited in Australia, is something that's going to be a benefit, because we have a lot of people applying for roles and employers will be faced with this. So making it easy and employers don't have to worry about is a positive. And you should really put notice periods in, because employers will be faced with various considerations of how fast they want to onboard somebody in this role. Also stating your interview availability, the times you're available. It eliminates questions that employers are going to have. And then they'll say, I can wait a month for this person if they're the right fit. And they're available next week for interview at these times after 5.
Interesting. I haven't heard of putting your residency status. That makes total sense. I like also notice periods. Yep. That's a different one that I haven't heard before. And giving them a rough estimate when they can do interviews or contact them is, as you were saying, the more information the recruiter or the hiring manager have about you, the more easier it helps them decide this person is very organised. I think it's worth a conversation. In the past, I think a lot of people try and hide things in their resume to maybe draw an interest to people. Like, oh, okay, as a recruiter, this person sounds interesting, but hasn't given me everything. Maybe I'll give them the call. But as you said, nowadays, there's so many people applying for the same role. Yep. You got to make the hiring manager or recruiter life a lot easier by having everything up front, so they can make that decision whether they should call you or not.
Totally agree, Yen. And it's also about creating a point of difference with yourself. Little things that you think are insignificant that we're talking about right now are very significant to the hiring manager, because they go, this person's just making it too easy for me. I really want to call them, because they've actually been proactive in thinking this through.
Yeah, for sure. And then just going back to a couple of things you said, you mentioned that there should only be particular fonts.
The choice of font's important, really important. I've screened resumes where they've used a font and I'm so inclined not to call them because of the choice of the font they've used, and because it's dated or it's just looking such a random choice for them to choose. You need to choose a font that's going to appeal to the masses, not just to you.
For example, I've seen some that still use Times New Roman.
Absolutely. You've got to stay with the times. There's many fonts you can choose, but I'm a big believer in choosing something that flows, like Calibri, that is neutral and very easy on the eye, really easy to read. Another thing that I'll add, people adding colour. Colour can break up the information and segments in your resume and make it really easier for the eye to flow through in terms of reading it as they're scanning it. So I'm a fan of it if it's used in the right context. You've got to be careful in the way you use it, but even just headings, not having crazy colours through your resume, and I'd stick to 2.
And just different tone of colour?
Different tone of colour, or a colour that's just easier on the eye. There's certain colours psychologically that have been proven that are more attractive to read than other colours. There's a plethora of the information on this on the web. A lot of things that people don't realise, but when you're looking at a whole range of resumes, and I see a resume that's in colour, that is broken up, it makes the resume easier to read and it just seems to flow.
Well, if you're looking at 100 CVs, you've got to make it stand out, as you said. And again, it comes back to catching the eye, making it simple as possible for the recruiter or the hiring manager to read.
Yeah.
And in terms of what you mentioned before, grammar, so obviously that's a big thing, because that shows that you've taken the time to make sure you've showing your eye for detail.
Correct.
What about in terms of spelling from appropriate dictionaries? In America, they use the Zs, and us, we use the S's in our words. If someone had a Z in there versus an S, what is your thoughts on that?
Grammar is critically important. You have to have the command of the English language in terms of representing yourself on paper, and it's showing the level of detail and care factor that you put into your resume. In terms of spelling, it needs to be relevant to the country that you're in, and I'm a big believer in that. So if you're using a spell check program and it's based on the American spelling, it's probably better to work on Australian text.
Yep. And your thoughts on adding your portrait or your photo of yourself on your CV? I know in the past that was quite popular. Is it still popular now? Because I assume everyone can just go into your LinkedIn profile if you have one, and there's a photo there anyway.
Exactly. You can have your LinkedIn profile as a reference point which they can go to. It depends on the role in terms of putting your photograph on a resume. For example, if it's going to be an advantage where you've got a front-facing position, I think that's an advantage. But if it's a role where they're employing you for your knowledge and your experience, I don't think it's relevant.
Yeah, gotcha. So, for example, as you said, if you're going to be a receptionist,
Yep.
you could put a picture up, and if you did, you want to make it look professional, that you're warm, you're approachable, because you're going to be the face of that organisation when people come into the office. Versus, an IT person who does coding and they can do that at home. They don't have to interact face-to-face with people.
100%.
Yeah.
It helps the hiring manager visualise the fit, and it can help them be beneficial in terms of speeding up the process of them calling you.
Excellent. You mentioned LinkedIn, but we'll come back to that one as well. I've got a couple of questions there, but we'll continue with the resume. When you look at the CV, everyone has a personal objective or a summary. A lot of people find that hard to write. What should be in that little one paragraph? And is it needed?
It's not needed, and it's not necessarily read. Recruiting managers have an overwhelming amount of information to sift through. So if they're screening a lot of resumes for a role, which is currently the climate we're in, there's a lot of people looking for work, people aren't going to not call you because your mission statement's not on there. And I would be saving my mission statement or any motivational drive in the interview process when they're actually talking to you. I think it's much more effectively communicated verbally than you putting down a mission statement on paper.
Interesting. I've always questioned, should that be there or not? But you're right. When I to review CVs, most of the time you just go for what are they currently doing now?
And when you're screening a lot of resumes, you just don't have time.
Great. You've mentioned the word screening a few times. Let's break that down a bit. My understanding in the past, recruiters use particular programs to screen certain resumes to make a shortlist. Is that a process?
For generic roles, absolutely. If you're doing a mass recruitment and you're needing 15 people to start in the call centre and you need entitlement to work in Australia cleared, it's a useful means of using that technology to ask that screening question. And there's also a bandwidth in salary, and you don't want to singly ask every single person that same question. That's a good use of that tool. But screening questions and screening programs are useful. It is the direction we're going, but there's definitely a methodology and an application where they should be used, but not govern the entire process.
So you mentioned the word screening questions, that when you're filling out the application, that makes sense. And then you said the screening software. Do you have an example of how that software works? Because my understanding is sometimes you need to make sure you have keywords in your resume so that screening program picks up your resume. Is that true?
Yes, it is. And that's how AI works and will work. So there's a lot of investment from these job boards that will identify key competencies or personal characteristics or experience in your resume, and they will pick up that wording in your resume and identify you based on how many times you use that word in your resume. So if we really want to get scientific about this, I can search key competency for a role, which is like organisation or attention to detail. You can increase your level of being called by how many times you use that in your resume. It's going to be picked up by AI and rated high because this person's mentioned it 3 times in their resume.
Yeah, so for example, if you're going for a customer service type role and you say the word customer focus or customer driven, the software might pick it up.
Yep. So identifying what are the key competencies or key characteristics in this role need to be reflected in your resume, but that will increase you getting called, which is what you're wanting to achieve. Another thing that I want to point out at this point, talked about colours and everything else, but people often forget this, that when you put your resume out there and the interview actually starts from the moment you're called. So if you answer the phone, yo, for a senior management role, or you've got a ridiculous voice message on your phone, and this sounds obvious, but I can tell you, if your mission is to find a job and find it effectively, I'd probably tailor down the colourful answering machine message, because I've heard ridiculous ones. I'm making an assessment on that person based on the voice message they've left. You don't want that. So you want sounding professional.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because I've also been given the feedback, and I share that with people that are looking for work, is definitely have a professional message, but also when a phone rings, if you are not in the right environment or the headspace, don't answer it. Let it go to voicemail. If it's a recruiter, call them back as soon as possible, but prepare yourself. So that way you're mentally ready to be able to answer those questions. Because I know sometimes where you just see a phone call and you just pick it up and you're not in the right headspace because something might have just happened 5 minutes ago, and then you don't do as well as you should have.
Yeah, classic example, don't answer the phone if you're in the bathroom.
Yeah, right. Happens a lot?
It happens more than
really?
you think.
Wow, okay. Yeah.
And I'll say another thing about resumes while I think of it too, is when you're submitting your resume is putting down your address. Now, people don't need to know where you live, and it can be useful in some contexts and not others. So if you know where the actual organisation is through the advert, and you know that it's going to be a benefit to demonstrate that you live in the area and you haven't got a long commute to work, all for it. And that they're not going to make a self-determination that it's too far for you to travel to work every day, and that's why they're discounting you for this role. It's a bit different today with the hybrid strategy that companies are employing. Obviously, they're going to always ask the question how you get to work or where do you live, what's your commute like, because they want to know it's sustainable. So it's going to be negative to you if you live across Sydney. So if you live on the Central Coast and the role's in Sydney, I just put that you live in the Sydney area, unless it's going to be an advantage to you putting your suburb down. One other thing I recommend people not to put their age on their resume. As I said, employers are focusing on particularly the last 5 years and the last 10 years. So if you're 22, you don't have this issue because you've only got a work history that's 4 years old, 5 years old, depending when you started work. But the last 10 years is important. Prior to that, it should be a paragraph saying, prior to this, I worked in the following companies in these positions. If you'd like to know more, happy to provide detail.
And with the age, they can work that out though when you finished high school, for example.
So
again, if you've been working for 20 years,
mm-hmm.
and in that education section, is it still worth putting when you finished high school?
You can put the date you did your HSC if you want to. I think it's important to put the secondary qualifications that you have. Qualifications are important for some roles. Sometimes they're not even considered for some roles. It's good to have, but it's not essential.
Gotcha. Let's continue breaking down the CV. So we covered education, so thank you. What about when we talk about your current role? People describe their responsibilities in bullet points, and then some people put it in a paragraph. Depends if you want to try and shorten it or make it more precise. Is there a particular way, or doesn't really matter, as long as you're highlighting the critical components of what you do?
I'm a big believer in what you just last said in terms of critical components should be listed out. Definitely it's bullet points. Reading an essay or anything that resembles paragraphs of text is just requiring more concentration from the person that's screening the resume. And if you're up against other people and you have to read what is literally looking like a page from a book, it can be requiring more attention span to actually look for what you're seeking. So bullet point can be 2 lines or 3 lines, that's fine if it's capturing the context of what you're doing and putting it in an articulate way, but don't waffle to the point. And your bullet points should be just easy to read, clearly identifying the appropriate fit for this role because you've done a role or a responsibility that's in line with the job that you're applying for, and that can be seen in the first 3 or 4 bullet points.
And the other thing is, my thoughts on this is, if I'm the recruiter, I'm hiring an office manager, I know what the normal day-to-day duties are. So for me, I will actually want to look at something from a CV point of view on what is beyond their responsibilities. So if I was going to apply for an office manager, I'm going to make that assumption that Peter here, who is hiring me, knows what a day-to-day life of an office manager is. So I'm just going to put in key points that I go beyond the duties.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I have to present at a stakeholder once every month. That's not a day-to-day responsibility. So I definitely want to put that in because I don't reckon other office managers get to do that.
So you got to come back to what the resume's purpose is. The resume's purpose is that Yen's going to call me because I'm an office manager. And so you would need to put, yes, generic bullet points that are reflective of what an office manager does. And that's reflective of all resumes that are suited to being an office manager. And the level of detail you're referring to, where they've had to report board meetings on ordering of supplies or coordinating budgets within the office in terms of what it's costing to run the office, and you've got to prepare a report to stakeholders the size of the organisation you're working for and how many hats you're wearing as an office manager. put that in. But I would restrict it to 8 to 12 bullet points. You can go overboard with bullet points. The more succinct you have it and to the point, you'll find a happy medium and a balance. If you put too little bullet points, like 3 or 4, sometimes that's not going to correlate to being enough detail.
Right. And I was told you want to have an achievement section in your last couple of roles. For example, as an office manager, the culture was really bad. I went out and did a survey. They gave the culture a 5 out of 10, but over my time as the office manager, created better atmosphere, did a new survey, and I actually got 8 out of 10.
I'm a big fan of selling yourself in a resume and putting it in bullet points. Not a big fan of probably having a section under each role saying achievements, because it becomes too much. Doesn't really get the bearing that they think they're going to get on paper. I think put it in the context of a bullet point, and it can be a reference point for being discussed as a guideline for the interviewer when they come to that point. It's not something to hide. I think you should reflect it in the way you communicate it in a bullet point. So a resume needs to flow, and you've got to keep coming back to the original idea of how well and organised and structured it looks on paper. I'm about saving time and making it easy angle for the actual interviewer to give you a call.
Gotcha. So if you are going to put some achievement stuff, incorporate it in just the responsibilities as a whole.
Yep.
Bullet points, and bullet points remain 12 max.
Yep.
And then those bullet points should get less as you're explaining your previous roles within that 5-year period. And anything beyond that, you can just, as you said, just have the name and title, and if you really want, one line saying what the key responsibility was.
Yep, definitely summarise. So it saves time in getting your resume down to 2 pages if you do it effectively. I think there's a mantra saying I should have my resume in 1 page. I don't think that's doing you justice. I think it's busy usually when I've seen those 1-page resumes, and a lot of people do it. 2 pages is the optimum if you really want my honest opinion.
Okay, great. Let's talk about tailoring it. We mentioned it a few times. I assume it's very important to tailor your resume to the role.
When you're applying to a role, you need to read the ad. People have got to be mindful of, guess, the key competencies that the hiring manager is looking for, and that can come from how the person's written the ad and what they're specifically targeting in terms of the level of experience they're after. And you should be really putting that in if you've done that, and that'll increase your chances of success. So when you talked about having that key competency word that's going to trigger the algorithm, let it resonate through your resume if you think it's going to be the thing that gets the call at the end of the day. And I want to also bring this up because it's coming up all the time. Be very careful of in-house job titles that aren't reflective of the position you're going for. For example, there may be complaints role, which in some organisations is referred to as customer assist, service solutions. It can be referred to as something completely different. So generic job titles need to be explained within an organisation that aren't sort of commonality out in the workforce. So you need to put in brackets for the person that's screening your resume. This is what the in-house job title is, but this is an explanation of what it does.
That's a really good point. That comes back down to, again, as you said, it's just a matter of making life easier for the recruiter. And what about the personal interest section? Also got told it can be quite a big of a disadvantage because you might not have the same interest as the person, the hiring manager. So they might go, well, this person isn't into the same thing as I am, or I can't see them fitting in my team. What are your thoughts on it?
If somebody doesn't identify with your areas of interest, it can be a simple way of saying maybe that person's not a person I'd like to work for.
Good point.
If someone is the right balanced manager, they're going to be interested in any sort of passion you have in life. So putting down personal interests, I'm a big fan of. It tells me a little bit more about the person, and I don't mind if your personal interests are completely eclectic and way out there. It's a point of interest. At the end of the day, we're all human beings. You're meeting someone for the first time when you're screening somebody, and it can be a conversation piece. It's an icebreaker. I love people that take me on a journey of their passion.
Right. And how important is a cover letter? Do people actually read the cover letter?
No. Glad you brought this up. Generalising, but most people will read the resume first. And if they identify with that person and then they're wanting more validation of why to call that person, they might go to the cover letter. A cover letter is critical to be really to the point, should be no longer than half a page. It's got to illustrate the key competencies that you think are relevant to this job. So you need to again put yourself in the mindset of who's written the role and who's doing the hiring and what they're looking for. And if you can absolutely knock it out of the park, if you guess the key behavioural characteristics that they're looking in that person, and that's where you can start to get quite exciting about illustrating competencies and achievements.
Excellent. So should you have a LinkedIn profile, no matter what industry you're in? And how different should it be to your resume?
LinkedIn profiles are a summary of your experience. They're not meant to be your resume online.
So you don't need to put your bullet points, for example?
No. The online presence is important and it's more validation.
Okay, finishing off, any final things you want to mention from a CV perspective?
Yeah, and I see it time and time again. A resume should be generating calls. People are contacting you. And so if you're not getting responses from companies, and I often hear this, I'm not hearing back from employers, I've sent my resume, haven't heard a thing back, and that's happening time and time and time again. You need to actually look at the document you're sending. You need to actually change your resume and redesign it, reconfigure it, incorporate some of the points we've discussed in this podcast. Look at the document differently. Look at it from the perspective of the person that's looking from a hiring perspective, and reinvent yourself. As simple as changing your resume and even having 2 or 3 different versions and seeing which version works best and which one's appealing and getting you a better response rate. And I'm a big advocate going with the one that works.
Totally, that makes total sense.
I want to talk about something else while I think of it, Ian.
Yeah, sure.
And I'll finish with this. When somebody's screening your resume, it's like a producer of a song rates how quickly they get to the chorus and how catchy the chorus is. And they should get to the chorus in the first 15 to 25 seconds. This is what's industry known. A resume is the same. I use that analogy. It's how well you set yourself out on paper and how catchy your resume is. And so your resume should really be infectious, that they just want to call you. And so you need to actually think that way, from putting yourself in the mindset of who's recruiting the role and what they're going to look for and what they're going to find attractive. And you can make your resume magnetic, and you can actually make your resume dance.
I like it. That's a really good tip. Thanks, Peter. Wow, there was seriously some good insights there from Peter, and I really enjoyed our conversation. What Peter said in that last point about making your CV a song, that really resonated with me, because in the end, it's about making your CV really easy to read for the recruiter while highlighting your critical skills so that you get that important phone call. If you found value in this episode, please click the follow button on the podcast so that you'll be alerted for the next episode where Peter and I dive into interview tips. Stay tuned, and in the meantime, make today a good news day.